Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will go over different opinions on mandatory vaccinations for Covid-19. Last week, the first of the Pfizer vaccines were given out in the UK, and since then it has been approved in the US and numerous other countries. The world is now starting the long and hard process of immunising humans to the virus. Some people, in fact, are calling for governments to implement mandatory vaccinations for the population in order to ensure that the disease is beaten properly and will not resurface. Many people, however, are hesitant to this because they claim it breaches their rights and for numerous other reasons. This episode will seek to cover these opinions both for and against mandatory vaccinations. Quick reminder, the aim is not to try and argue for or against mandatory vaccinations, but rather to highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. I'll begin with the arguments in favour of mandatory vaccinations, followed by those opposed with a comparison at the end. The main argument in favour of mandatory vaccinations is that it is necessary to stop the pandemic, which has thus far killed over 3 million people and shows no signs of slowing down. If the vaccine is not given out in high enough numbers, some fear that the vaccine will not be as effective as many people hope, and many more people, it is argued, will die without mandatory vaccinations, and the virus may persist for a much longer period of time. And as such, it is important to immunise everyone in the world, although, at least in this case, everyone in countries that can afford the vaccine, and that way you are guaranteed, essentially, to prevent the virus from resurfacing, especially on this point, given that it's not 100% effective. None of these vaccines are 100% effective. So if you get everyone, you're guaranteed that even that, for example, 5% for the Pfizer vaccine will not be enough, given that so many other people have already been vaccinated. Furthermore, some claim that vaccines should be mandatory in order to prevent those who cannot take the vaccine for medical reasons from suffering with the virus. Those with medical reasons who cannot get the vaccine, for example, they may elicit allergic reactions or other various complications in the process, may catch it from someone who has not had the vaccine, and they probably would have taken it, but they weren't able to medically. And as such, everyone else should be mandatory to have the vaccine in order to ensure that any group who cannot take it will not be affected. Essentially, it's this difference between cannot take it and don't want to take it, and for a lot of people they believe that if you can take it, you should be forced to take it for the betterment of other people who cannot. Furthermore, some people claim that the risks to public health from not having a vaccine outweigh people's effective right to choose whether or not to have it. Similar to essentially lockdown views, some believe that health at this time especially needs to come before rights, and that it doesn't matter if you feel your rights are being violated and you don't want the vaccine, on the basis that collectively everyone will benefit from everyone having a vaccine, whereas you individually may suffer because you don't want it. And as such, you should put aside your personal self-interest and think of the bigger picture, at least to these people. And then finally, these people in favour of the vaccine will point to the integrity of the science behind it. National regulatory bodies have a very strict and thorough process to approve a vaccine, and the vaccine, the Pfizer one, has gone through rigorous and essentially, they say, thorough clinical trials. And as such, the people who are in favour of mandatory vaccinations trust the scientists who made the vaccine, and the scientific bodies who regulate and approve the vaccine, essentially to say that this is safe and therefore people should have it, and that essentially on the point of the speed of the vaccine, they would say it is justified given that there's been more money put into this vaccine than any other vaccine in history, and there's been such a large effort, and they've also just been building upon vaccines developed for pre-existing respiratory and in particular other forms of coronavirus, and as such they trust the science behind it, and therefore people don't really, in their view, have a reason not to get a vaccination. Moving on now to those who oppose mandatory vaccinations. Firstly, and perhaps the main reason people oppose the mandatory vaccination is essentially that they do not trust the process, essentially. Most vaccines take many years, maybe even decades, to produce, and as such, some are not entirely sure of a vaccine that was produced in under 9 months. And although it did have essentially some pre-existing research behind it, this particular vaccine was produced in a very quick amount of time. And some say that governments, regulatory bodies and companies have rushed through the vaccine, both either to make money or to essentially return life to normal as quickly as possible and limit further damage to economies. And that forced vaccines in this case are bad because if someone, as in this example, don't trust the science, they argue that they shouldn't be forced to take the vaccine. That even though there are a lot of conspiracy theories around this, I don't really want to go into those because they're not backed in essentially logical thinking. A lot of people do have a rational thought that they just don't trust this at the speed it was made, and therefore especially a mandatory vaccine is very unfair to try and force people to take a vaccine that they don't believe in. And this is worsened by the idea that it is in their rights not to be forced to take it. Essentially, people opposing mandatory vaccinations at times believe that their rights come first and that they cannot be forced to take a vaccine in the name of public health, as to some people this can have repercussions down the line where health is used as an excuse to force people to sacrifice their own personal rights, and that it is essentially an ideological standpoint whether or not you put yourself or society first, and as such people are well within their rights to put themselves first if they don't want to take the vaccine, and therefore shouldn't be forced to take it. And then finally, people argue that mandatory vaccines just simply aren't necessary, as this vaccine is going to be taken by a massive amount of people, and as such, if everyone who wants the vaccine takes it, there will be enough people immunised to limit the spread of the virus, and people who choose not to take it, despite all the information, know the risks and take self-responsibility. And to some people, they even say that if they die because they would choose to not have the vaccine, that's their own decision, and that everyone who wants it and everyone who's high risk can take it. You're not going to catch it if you've already had the vaccine, and therefore people shouldn't be forced to take it because everyone who doesn't want it knows what they are getting themselves into. Moving on now to a comparison. Firstly, on the question of rights. Those who support mandatory vaccinations believe that rights are not as important as health, and that people should put aside their self-interest and their own beliefs in the vaccine for the protection of society and just everyone in general. And therefore people should be forced to take it because some may not otherwise, if they believe it's in their rights, and as such, essentially we just need to make people take it, and that health is more important, while those on the other side would say that rights are important and cannot be violated in the name of health. It's an ideological standpoint which is then conflicting with a real scenario, and ideology shouldn't be forcing people, essentially at this point, to put aside their own interest in the name of society, and that there are further problems that this poses in the future for essentially violating rights for public health. Then on the question of science, those in favour of mandatory vaccinations have to, and do, trust the science. They say that it's been approved by regulatory officials and it's built upon prior research, and that people who don't trust the science are essentially believing either misinformation or some extreme examples of conspiracy theories, and that therefore these people are not thinking rationally and should be forced to take it, because a lot of people, they argue, won't take it due to irrational fears, and as such the only way to ensure that people are taking it in high enough numbers is to force people to have it. Whereas on the other side would say that they don't trust the science and they're entitled not to trust the science, especially at the speed that this has gone on, and the fact that essentially it's in everyone's who's producing the vaccine and distributing it in all their best interest, essentially, to have the vaccine distributed and taken by as many people as possible. And as such, they have, in their view, genuine fears as to why the vaccine may not be as good as some people claim it is to be. And then finally, on the question of protecting others, those in favour of mandatory vaccines would argue that everyone has to take it to ensure that enough people are protected and that the virus cannot be spread. Essentially, there's a fear that if enough people are too sceptical of the vaccine and they do not take it, then it will not be very effective. And some people, again, who cannot take it for medical reasons, and other people who can't get it for whatever reason, will be affected because other people chose not to take it, and therefore it should be mandatory to protect everyone. While those on the other side would say that it doesn't matter, that everyone who wants the vaccine can take it, and people who choose not to know the risks and they are taking the decision themselves, and they can live with it, essentially, on this side of the argument. And as such, it is viewed by these people that it shouldn't be mandatory and it should ultimately be down to a person's individual choice. Overall though, those in favour of mandatory vaccines believe in the importance of the vaccine and trust it to defeat Covid-19, although the opposed to mandatory vaccinations support self-determination and responsibility, and in many cases have a genuine distrust at the process given the speed the vaccine was produced. Ultimately though, it appears most countries will not adopt mandatory vaccination so long as enough people volunteer to take the vaccine, and although it looks like that will happen, whether or not it is in high enough numbers remains to be seen. But is there anything that I got wrong, or missed, or could do better? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter. There will be no episode next week because it's Christmas, and then after New Year we will be going back to 2 episodes a week. So see you on the 1st of January for the next episode. Have a nice Christmas. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.